My name is Mike Hammond. I am the partner in charge here at O'Connor & Drew in the OCD Tech IT Audit and Security practice. So our team here, we've got 35 people dedicated to IT audit and security related strictly on data security, pen tests, vulnerability assessments. And then at the same time, we have Kate here as well. She's our regulatory specialist. She's been with us coming up on 3 years now. Everything that she does is related to either federal regulations or state regulations all around IT security and data. So Kate will be able to give us a really good perspective on what we're seeing right now coming out of the FTC with this updated. And then after Kate's part of the presentation, we'll switch it back and I'll be able to talk about what we see in your dealerships themselves related to this new FTC rule and how it's probably going to impact your operations going forward. So high-level background. So this new FTC rule, it's really enhancements to an existing rule that comes out of GLBA. So from the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, this has to do all around the way that you're protecting the financial information of your customers. And so what's happened now is back on about 3 years ago, the FTC came out and said, we're going to come out with some enhanced guidance around the data security safeguards that you're supposed to have in place. And it was really geared towards financial institutions. What's happened though is they've seen that companies are not protecting client information like it should be, or to the degree that they want. And so what they've done now is they've come out with some enhanced guidance for what you're supposed to be doing related to these safeguard rules. About 3 years ago, the thing that really stirred this up was that some of this enhanced guidance specifically called out motor vehicle dealers. And that started up a big flurry of comments back to the FTC on what this means for auto dealers, the size of an auto dealer, how many records do you have to maintain for this to actually take effect? What are the types of things that you're supposed to be doing? And so what ended up happening was many industry groups, including NADA, submitted some comments to the FTC about the impact that this is going to cause to an auto dealership. So here's a comment back from 2019 where Bradley Miller from NADA said, this is going to obviously negatively impact many dealerships, especially the smaller dealerships that don't have dedicated IT, don't have dedicated teams, enterprise-wide teams to be able to secure and validate that the data is secure as it should be, not compared to someone like a large financial bank. The GLBA law applies to banks now just as much as it's applying to auto dealers, and they're trying to lump the auto dealers into the same group that you get when you have someone like a financial institution, these huge banks that have teams and teams of people that secure data. They're now saying that this is applying to you as well. And so NADA obviously put together some details. We sent some information up through the MSADA that made its way up to NADA as well, that basically said, look, this is just going to be so costly for auto dealers in order to comply with this law. And we put together some estimates on what we thought it would cost for both small, mid-size, and large dealer groups to comply with every one of these proposed rules. And we came out to about the same thing that they ended up putting into Automotive News that made it up to NADA as well, that it's going to be around $200,000, $300,000 a year in additional costs for you to comply with these new rules the way that they were written. And so hopefully, this information a couple of years ago in 2019 was going to influence some of FTC's guidance going forward on the changes that might end up happening before the rule actually takes effect. Even as recently as September of last year, the FTC actually talked to some people from NADA about what the impact was. And in this letter, what ended up happening was NADA was saying, look, the dealers don't often have control over some of this data, especially all the data that's stored in the DMS. Oftentimes the contracts are a one-way contract. You get very little input into being able to change the rules in a language in the contract that you sign with some of these larger DMSs. At the same time, you're asking for the protections in the DMS, but if the DMS provider gets breached, that's how do you control that? You don't have control over their security. So, why are you being held liable for it? Even though it's, technically it's your clients and you're supposed to be protecting that information. And so the FTC got with NADA. NADA made that case as well and said, like, look, this is, some of this stuff is out of our control. Why are you holding our feet to the fire for this? Unfortunately, now that I've told you all the bad news or everything that ended up happening, all of this kind of went on deaf ears. And so what I want to do in the next part of this is really hand this over to Kate, and she's going to talk about what was in the proposed rules, what's actually now in the new rule, and when and how it's going to happen.
Thanks, Mike. So the purpose of this rule is to strengthen the data security controls that financial institutions have in place to protect consumer data. So the FTC is looking at all these events and these hacks that have happened recently, and is seeking to lessen the odds that an individual's data is exploited generally. So like Mike talked about, the FTC updated and finalized the rule to require non-banking financial institutions like auto dealers and mortgage brokers to develop, implement, and to maintain a comprehensive data security program to safeguard that consumer data. Mike, you can go to the next slide if you want. I don't think I can do it.
Did not turn, it turned on my end.
Did it? Okay, it turned now, thanks. So when the rule comes into effect, so the rule has to make its way through the federal rulemaking process to become in effect or to be applicable. So the process involves a federal agency like the FTC and a federal registry through the National Archives, or NARA, as some of you might know it. So when a rule is published or to the Federal Register, it'll start the clock for when organizations should be compliant with the rule. So from a time a federal agency sends a rule to be published on the Federal Register, it typically takes NARA a few days to a few weeks. I personally reached out to the FTC to ask them when this rule would be published, and they gave me a highly specific answer of soon. So in government speak, I do think that that means a couple of weeks rather than a couple of months. We can move to the next slide. So how is this rule applied? The rule applies to non-banking financial institutions. That definition in this final rule has been expanded to include finders. So financial institutions in this sense refers to mortgage lenders, motor vehicle dealers, and payday lenders. The reason auto dealers are included in this is because they offer financing, or at least connect consumers with financing options when they go to buy a vehicle. Finders refer to organizations that connect consumers with financial institutions, so like a mortgage broker or a tax preparer. We can move forward. So how this is applied continued. The rule applies to all financial institutions. So there's no threshold that would completely absolve a financial institution for being on the hook. However, for organizations that hold data for fewer than 5,000 customers, some requirements don't apply. And we'll go over what those requirements are that won't apply here in a minute. So I reached out to the FTC again about this directly, and what we wanted to know was if the rule was data for 5,000 consumers annually or over a lifetime, and they responded that it was 5,000 consumers period. So not annually, but total, however many consumers data you have on your network right now. So what does consumer mean, right? So consumer in the context of this rule refers to individuals that act for personal, family, or household purposes, meaning this does not include businesses nor the employees therein that you might service. So John Doe walks off the street and comes in to purchase a car to go to work or to take his family to soccer practice, it would apply to that person. It's not John Doe off the street who comes in to buy a truck for his landscaping business or a Fortune 100 company trying to buy a fleet. We can move forward. So exceptions to this rule. So like we talked about, organizations that hold data for fewer than 5,000 customers are not on the hook for every requirement in the rule. So if you're below that 5,000 threshold, you're excused from the requirements on the slide there. So performing a risk assessment, implementing continuous monitoring, or doing an annual penetration test, developing an incident response plan, and then the requirement for a written status report to management by that qualified individual, which we'll talk about later. If you fall under the exemption, you're on the hook for the rest of the requirements, but not the ones on the screen there. And we can move forward. So what changed? And like Mike talked about, it was really not much that changed from the initial rule to the final rule. The FTC solicited comments and seemed to respond, but disregard most of them. But the biggest change that there was a requirement for a chief information security officer, or a CISO, which was unrealistic for most shops, I think. So the FTC changed that verbiage to be qualified individual, which means that you have to have someone at your organization that has some level of information security training and knowledge. So this doesn't need to be a dedicated resource. So if you have like a parts manager or something at your organization that has the time, but also the proper background in information security, it's totally fine to have that person fulfill that role. Certainly, larger organizations will probably want someone dedicated for that role, but this does lessen the burden for those smaller institutions. It's also applicable to outsource, or I'm sorry, acceptable to outsource this function. So you can hire a managed service provider or a third party that offers, a virtual CISO or something like that to perform this function for your organization. And requirements for the rule. So I'll pass it back to Mike now to talk more about the requirements for the rule and what you folks might be doing already that can satisfy some of these.
Thanks. So the problem was that we were hoping that we would see a lot of ability for the smaller dealers to get some kind of grace or the ability to not have to implement all of these requirements, because a lot of these are going to be expensive, time-consuming, continuous requirements that you're going to end up needing to do for the dealership. And like Kate said, we didn't see a lot of that happen. The FTC rule came out and Bob, sent an email saying, hey, this thing is going to get published. And the first thing I wrote back to Bob was like, oh no, this is, when we were talking about this 3 years ago, we were talking about the problems that it's going to cause and the costs for the small dealerships. And like Kate said, the problem is that they didn't end up giving any leniency on this. So, they're still looking for things like maintaining the written information security plan, the qualified individuals, the risk assessments. And so what I wanted to do was be able to say like, okay, we have all of these things, but maybe some of these areas you're compliant already. And so, when we talk about the 5,000 record limit or the 5,000 customer limit threshold, some of the things that are in there, you're probably already doing anyways, because for the state of Massachusetts, you might need you have to have a written information security program already. So what we want to do is help that, if you start to look at these things, are there areas that you're already meeting so that you can say, okay, this isn't going to cost me $200,000 a year because I'm already doing some of this. So maybe you already have a written information security plan because you're in Massachusetts and you have a WISP already. Microsoft Word, you don't have to go out and buy a new tool to be able to put together an information security plan. There's a lot of attributes that need to be put in it, but maybe you already have it. So maybe you already have tools like Archer and Compliance Forge and that has the WISP already put in it. The one thing that I'm probably confident that most dealers, not for the larger groups, but most of definitely the medium and smaller dealers, is designating that qualified individual. They're not prescriptive in the new rule on certifications that this individual has to have, years of service or anything like that in information security. That's not in the language of the text. What is in there is, though, it says that this person must have background and training in information security commensurate with the size of the organization. And so, like Kate was saying, it can be someone where it's a part-time job for them, but they have to have some knowledge in information security to be able to make the decisions. Unfortunately, that even though they say that it can be a part-time job, all of the things that need to happen are going to fall on this person's shoulders. And so they're going to have to spend a good amount of time making sure that the information security plan is updated, that it's reviewed, things like that as well. So even though it can be a part-time job, this person's going to be spending a lot of time working on this anyways. Another area that I don't think, at least when we go in and do assessments of dealerships, that we don't see that dealers have right now, and it's something that you would end up having to do if you are clearing this threshold, is performing a risk assessment. You don't have to go out and buy fancy tools for it. Microsoft Word will do the job, but you are going to have to spend time. This qualified individual is going to have to spend time going through the information to figure out, going through the shop to figure out what kind of information do you have, where is it stored, what are the risks to that information if it gets out, and then what controls and mitigating plans do you have in place to make sure that that doesn't happen. They'll have to periodically review these access controls. And so when I talk later about some of the enforcement actions that we've seen from the FTC, one of them really is having someone go through it. It's no good if you have this policy in place, you have all the plans, but no one's actually testing it to make sure that it's working as designed. Because otherwise what will happen is the FTC is going to say, that's great that you had it, but you weren't actually doing it. And so there is a component in the new rule that talks about having to test the actual controls. They don't say it needs to be an external auditor. It doesn't have to be an internal audit function within your company, but it does need to be tested. Managing the data, a big portion of it is creating and maintaining that inventory. And so you have to have a documented list of where does the data sit. You've done that assessment, you've gone through to figure out where is all of the customer information, so their personal private information that's supposed to stay private. Where is that information stored? And it includes paper records as well. This isn't all about information, IT related records. This, you've got to consider where the paper records are as well. If you don't have this inventory, it's going to be impossible to do all of the other controls. So one of the first things that you're going to end up doing is doing some type of review of where is the data. Some of the ones that I know that many dealers don't have is around encryption at rest. Most people, because of the Massachusetts law, we've had encryption in motion for a long time. So if you're using Office 365 or if you're using one of the DMS providers and they've got a website with the little lock on it, so you know that it's encrypted, that's fine. That's encryption in motion. What the new rule is talking about is encryption at rest. And so now you've got to think about things like, okay, you've got laptops and that hard drive might be encrypted, but what about the servers? If you've got like a local NAS server or an external hard drive in a closet somewhere where you might be storing some data, is that data encrypted when it's sitting there at rest? The new rule is going to talk about looking at that it wants data to be encrypted at rest. There is a caveat in there that you can use alternate means to protect this data. So it doesn't need to be encrypted at rest, but now this is going to get back to the qualified individual, that person that you've designated to be the head of your information security program at your dealership, is going to have to sign off on that these protections, this alternate protection, is equivalent equivalent to the encryption at rest. And if anything ever happened where the FTC was coming in to look at the environment, they're going to evaluate. So for the size of your group and the type of data you had, were these alternate methods appropriate? So it might be easier to look just at encryption at rest than to try to come up with alternate methods and justify why those were okay. The next one is software development lifecycle. We don't see that this is really going to apply to auto dealers much. This one really has to do with the way that you create applications. You might release changes into your environment, who reviews the code changes. So we don't see that this one's going to apply directly to auto dealers that much. If you were doing some kind of custom applications, you would have to comply with this, but we don't anticipate that this one's going to affect the dealers. The next one absolutely is going to affect the dealers. And this is the one that's going to be somewhat tedious from a policy perspective, in that you're going to have to evaluate your vendors. A big component of the FTC actions that we saw, or that we've seen on their website, where they talk about the adverse actions and the different cases that they have, all relate, or not, a lot of them relate to the environment around managing your vendors. If you're taking your customers' data and handing it off to a vendor, and so maybe that's related to marketing, or maybe it's related to, definitely related to the DMS, what work have you done to ensure that that vendor, so the DMS provider, has adequate security? Have you reached out to the vendor? And a very common one would be to ask the vendor for a SOC 2 report. Does that vendor have a SOC 2 report where they can detail the type of data that they're maintaining and the security controls that they have in place to make sure it happens? The FTC Safeguards Rules definitely talk about your liability, your requirement to ensure that that data is secure doesn't end with you sending it up to the DMS. They want to make sure that you've got skin in the game, to make sure that you're looking at what is the DMS doing to make sure that that information is secure. So a big part of this new rule is going to be making sure that you're looking at all your vendors, anyone who has access to the data. So it could even be things like the cleaning crew that comes in at night. If they have the ability to, if you're leaving deal sheets and financial information lying around, they're now in scope because they have the ability to see this data, which then goes back to where is the data being stored and who has access to it. So if you don't have that inventory, you're not going to be able to figure out the controls that are in place to figure out who has access to the data in these service providers. And that's going to go along, same thing, like if it's the people that maintain your IT network. If they're admins of your network, they've got the ability to see your data. And if they can see your data, what are they doing with it? That's going to apply to us as well. If we're looking at your RO work, if we've got financial information of your customers because you're handing it to us for the warranty work, you're going to be asking us, what are we doing to protect that data as well? You're going to have to take a real hard look at all of the places where you're sending this data. One of the next ones is the establishing the incident response plan. This is one of the ones that the threshold exists for the 5,000, but if you're over 5,000 records, over 5,000 customers, you need to come up with an incident response plan. And it's going to be pretty prescriptive on the type of attributes that need to be in that plan, on what to do and who you're going to call if you did have a breach. One of the comments, one of the areas in the new rule that has not been put into the FTC safeguards yet, there will be an open comment period coming up, is what to do when there's a data breach and the notifications that happen. Right now, there's not a notification requirement to the FTC if you have a breach in a certain amount of time, but that is coming up for comment, and they're going to look for things like, there's talk about that if you have a breach, that you will have 10 days to notify the FTC of that breach. So there'll definitely be some us going back and forth with the FTC on that as well, about the ability to, one, even notify, or even for you to realize when there is a breach in your own network, and for you to even meet that 10-day requirement. Some of the more technical areas that we'll see that are going to be part of this new rule is the requirement to implement multi-factor authentication. Many of the dealerships that we go into that have either migrated to something like Office 365 or have some of these DMS providers is, is the DMS provider requiring you to have two-factor authentication? And so remember, this is something you have and something you know. So when you log into the DMS, does it prompt you on your phone to enter in a 6-digit code? When you log into your email, Office 365 in the cloud or Google, do you have two-factor authentication turned on? We still do go to dealerships where they don't have two-factor turned on. This is absolutely a requirement going forward. Not only is it a requirement for the FTC Safeguards rules, but there was probably a good 3 or 4 years where many dealerships, or many companies, not just dealerships, were saying, you know what, we're just going to get insurance for our data security. So if there's a breach, we've got an insurance policy that covers this. And what's happening lately with the insurance companies is they're dropping customers that don't have two-factor authentication. So much like, you'll get lower premiums if you're a non-smoker and you're healthy and you go through that physical screening for medical insurance. The same thing's happening now with the cyber insurance, where the underwriters are just saying, if you don't have two-factor authentication, we're not even going to give you a policy. They're done paying out these huge claims for companies that weren't doing adequate security, and two-factor authentication is definitely one of those key areas that they're looking for. You'll have to define a data retention policy. How long do you keep that data for? And again, this is going to go back to where is the data. So if you don't know where you're storing all of those Excel spreadsheets that you're exporting out of the DMS, there's no way for you to know where it is, how you're going to know how long to keep it for, where, and then how you'll be able to delete it once those 7 years come up or 5 years comes up, whatever it is. The next one here, the change management process. I don't think this one's going to apply much to the dealers as well. This talks a lot about the significant changes to your environment. And so if you think about significant changes to your data, how often are you maybe changing the DMS? How often are you maybe moving from on-prem server to Office 365 or to Google? Something like that would necessitate probably a change management process. Did people test it? Did you test the security before going live? Who signed off on it? Who approved it? Things at a smaller dealership, probably everyone knows already that you're moving to Office 365, but on smaller changes, we're not going to see a lot of impact on this change management process. You're not writing your own dealer management system, so we're not going to see a lot of impact here. One that I do think is going to financially cost dealers money and potentially some significant money here is the monitoring for log activity. So in this case, what they're looking for now is, are you looking for activity that's happening to your environment? And so that could be in the DMS, it could be on your workstations, it could be on your VPN or your Office 365, anywhere where you've got that customer information. Are you capturing the logs and then evaluating it, monitoring it for actual activity? The biggest difference here, I think, from the older rules to this new one is it's no longer just failed logins that they're looking for. So, is someone trying to hack in and you see that they're constantly getting denied? Now what they're looking for is the successful ones as well. So if you had to go back in time and figure out who had access to certain data and who modified certain data, so who actually made a change to a record, that's the type of information they're looking for in this new monitoring and logging of new activity. And so it was easier and cheaper to log failed logins because there's far less of them than it is to log the successful logins. Successful logins, we're talking about everyone who's using your system every day. And so this is a lot of data that's going to start getting collected. So we'll see a fairly significant cost to the implementation on the logging portion of it. If you are over the 5,000 threshold, you're looking at continuous monitoring or pen testing. And they do specifically call in their pen testing. So Are you running a vulnerability scanner on your own environment? And this isn't just a scanner to look for the inventory of the laptops and how many devices are there and how much disk space is left. This is they're looking for, are there vulnerabilities in your network? Are people able to exploit these vulnerabilities? And then if you do find these vulnerabilities, what is the qualified individual doing to help make sure to reduce the exposure to these vulnerabilities? So they're looking for a continuous monitoring program put in place. So maybe you need to scan your internal network once a week, look for vulnerabilities, look for missing patches on your equipment, and then make sure that someone's patching them. You rescan and make sure that the environment is as secure as it can be over time. This will definitely be continuous monitoring. It's definitely going to be another component to it that's going to have some significant cost. It's going to be you're going to have a tool to do it and someone to actually maintain and run this process for you. So we do see a good amount of cost on that section as well. The next one, the maintain policies and procedures. Someone's going to have to, the qualified individual is going to have to document these procedures related to all these other programs that we talked about before. What are you doing for two-factor authentication? What are you doing for your pen testing and continuous monitoring? And what are you logging? Who's reviewing those logs? All of those policies and procedures need to be put in place. Maybe you have a tool, a GRC, a records tool for this already, but if not, something as easy as SharePoint, a file server with Word documents, or even if you're going to print these out and put them in a file cabinet, that's fine. All of that is fine, but it's something that's definitely going to be needed. So another portion of it is establishing the security awareness training. So we do this a lot for some of the auto dealers now, and this is the thing where we're sending you constant emails to try to get you to click on links and train your employees on security awareness. What makes a bad email? What are the things that you should look out for? These are the types of things that the new FTC Safeguards Rule is looking for to make sure that you've got in place some type of program for employee security awareness training. The Massachusetts WISP already requires this. So hopefully you're already doing some type of security awareness training. Best case, you're doing it on onboarding when the employee comes in. You tell them what your policy is, what your data security policy is. And then at least the Mass WISP requires annual training as well. So at some point, are you training your users at least annually on data security? The easiest way to do this is through some type of automated phishing campaigns, through tools like KnowBe4, things like that as well. One of the last things that the new rule is going to require is that this qualified individual sends a report at least annually to management on the status of the compliance. So this qualified individual is going to have to go through all of the previous things we talked about and document and make sure that not only do we have the procedures for what's required, but the evidence to support that it's actually being effective and that they're running. So this is where we're going to get into, not only do we have to have the procedures, we're going to have to test them and then generate that report and give it to management so that management can see that the program's actually being effective. All of these, some of these, again, you may already be doing, and maybe they're all in piecemeal, but eventually what's going to end up having to happen is all of this is going to have to be put on the shoulders of this new qualified individual to do it. We went through some of the FTC cases to kind of give you some insight into where we see this happening with the auto dealers. Most of the cases that we currently see now, as you'd expect for GLIBA, relate to financial services firms like Venmo and Lending Club and Equifax and things like that. We don't see a lot that relate to auto dealers themselves that have to do with the data security. Most of the FTC actions that we see against the auto dealers right now relate to some kind of deceptive practice for, if someone's coming in to buy a car and the dealership is fudging the numbers on the dealer forms and things like that and gets caught. That's where we see most of the current FTC enforcement actions against dealers. The only thing that we see that relates to data security for dealers prior to this rule coming into place is this DMS provider dealer built. And the reason I have this on here is if you went through the list of the items that the FTC listed in the enforcement action against dealer built, they're almost word for word, and 14 out of 14 related to what we now see in the new FTC Safeguards Rule. So they were talking about the information that dealer built had in their DMS of all of the customers the dealerships that were using dealer built. Information was stored in clear text. So we didn't have the encryption at rest. They didn't have an information security plan. They weren't providing data security for their employees. They didn't assess the risks. So if you go through every one of these things that the FTC listed back in 2019 against dealer built, is almost word for word the things that we're seeing in the new FTC Safeguards Rule about the things that you're going to have to do going forward. And so what ended up happening was dealer built now has to do what is in the FTC Safeguards Rule. They have to designate an officer to provide annual certifications. So unlike having to provide it to management every year, dealer built has to do that, but they also have to provide it to the FTC as well. They have to now do everything that they're supposed to have been doing, but also prove it to the FTC. And one of the biggest problems that they have now is dealer built has to now also do this for the next 20 years and keep the data for 5 years going forward. So for every one of the areas that they're generating this documentation, they're going to have to now keep doing this for almost as long as they're in business for at least the next 20 years. And so the FTC is saying like, look, we caught you doing the wrong thing. And now going forward, we're going to watch you. And so they're having to provide this and retain this information going forward like this. So dealer built didn't end up with a monetary, as part of settling the case, they agreed to do this kind of stuff. They didn't end up with a monetary fine here, but they're going to have these compliance costs going forward for, keeping 5 years worth of records every year for the next 20 years. So that's all related to the new FTC rules. What I wanted to do was talk about, because this is for the mass auto dealers, you're already doing, hopefully, a lot of these because MA201 has existed for years now. And so much of what you're doing related to MA201, hopefully some of these components you're doing in what would be required in the new FTC Safeguards Rules as well. So having to have a written information security program, hopefully you've already got this document. It wasn't written in 2009 when the law came out. It's been written and updated every year because there is requirements to look at it every year. Have you designated one or more employees to supervise the WISP's implementation? We talked to a lot of dealerships and they do have someone that is in charge of the WISP. But now this new rule is going to require that this person have specific security backgrounds in order to be that designated individual. It can't be the owner of the company unless the owner of the company has some specific background in it. Have you identified all the places where you have data? So again, it's, you're going to have to get an inventory. You're going to have to go through and document the people and the places where all the data exists. That already existed in the Massachusetts rule as well. Have you identified and evaluated reasonably foreseeable risks? So in the new rule, you have to do a risk assessment and document that risk assessment. MA201 already required that. So hopefully you've got some sense of what, how to meet this requirement. But the new FTC Safeguards Rule is going to really require the documentation for it. Have you evaluated the effectiveness? So this is the continuous monitoring. Having a company come in and do the assessment or figure out a way to do it internally yourselves. So a lot of these things in the MA201 rule already exists. Have you taken reasonable steps to retain third-party service providers that are capable to maintain the security? Have you required those providers to implement security measures? So if you're talking to the DMS, are you looking at, have they done everything that you're asking them to? And so maybe this is somewhere where you could leverage a SOC 2 report or something like that. So much of MA201 hopefully has the requirements in there already that you're doing. under this new FTC Safeguards rules, but there's going to be a good amount of documentation and evidence that you would need to collect in order to be compliant. There are definitely some gaps in the rule from MA201, and the biggest one really is the encrypting of records. MA201 only requires encryption in transit, whereas the new FTC Safeguards is going to require encryption at rest. So you're going to have to figure out where you're storing all this data, how long are you storing it for, and do you have appropriate encryption methods in order to make sure that that information is protected. If you have laptops, that really is considered encryption in transit, because now at this point, that laptop is probably leaving the building. The minute it leaves your four walls, it's in transit. So hopefully the laptop's encrypted, because now this is encryption in motion versus encryption at rest. And that's where they're going to look for the new rule being under encryption at rest. And then, hopefully the last thing in the MA201 is the security training for your employees. So hopefully you're already doing this. And if you're not, this is where, you're going to look to start doing when a new employee joins the firm, and then every year after that, at least once a year, because there is an annual requirement for security training. We'd say that annual is far too short. When we do it for our clients, we're doing it continuously. We'll continuously send them phishing emails to help train them on how to look for malicious emails. And then, if they end up clicking on a bad link, they'll get an immediate notification. The employees are going to be that first line of defense from someone trying to get into your network from the outside through email. And so having them trained sufficiently on what to look for and be suspicious of emails is definitely something that you've got to look for there. We're doing this presentation for Connecticut a little bit later today. So quickly, if you do have dealerships in Connecticut, or you've got customers out of Connecticut, Connecticut does have this new law that incentivizes adoption of the cybersecurity standards. And so if you are meeting the requirements of some program like this FTC Safeguards Rule, or some of these other NIST, National Information Standards of Technology, data security rules, Connecticut actually prevents you from being sued and getting assessed punitive damages. So if you can prove that you had a good program in place, but you were still hacked by some foreign entity, some foreign nation, what are we going to do if we're trying to protect ourselves against one of these other foreign nations? No one has enough money and time to be able to do that. Connecticut has put in a law that says, that's okay. We'll prevent you from being assessed those punitive damages if you can prove that you have this program in place. So if you're already going to meet the NIST 800-171 guidelines, meet ISO 27001, or meet these FTC Safeguards rules, if you've got a good program in place and you can prove it, maybe Connecticut won't go after you for some of these other punitive damages. So it's going to be a big law, big rule that comes down when it ends up happening. Again, as soon as we see it published, then we'll have 30 days to get some of the requirements done. You'll have 1 year to get all of it done, but we'll definitely send out a notification through our contacts and either Bob through the MSADA notifications as well, to let everyone know that the clock has started on these. If you have any questions offline that we haven't answered in the Q&A, definitely feel free to reach out to either Kate or I on either through our emails or connect to us on the website. So thank everyone for joining. And again, if you have any questions, definitely feel free to let us know. The session is being recorded. So once it's done, once the session's over, we'll make the link available so that MSADA can send it out, and then we can send it out as well. So thank you everyone for the time. Have a good day.